In opening arguments today, District Attorney Ashley Rich said the deaths of 4-year-old Natalie and 3-year-old Chase Deblase were a real-life horror movie. Rich contends it was John Deblase who killed both his children with his bare hands.
Welcome back, and thanks for being here. I'm Cassie, and this is A Wicked World. The story I have for you today is about two children who lived full-time with their father. But then one day, their father got a very controlling and jealous girlfriend who hated his children. So much, in fact, that she was willing to do whatever she had to get rid of them for good. This is the story of Natalie and Chase Deblase. Natalie and Chase Deblase were born to their parents John Deblase and Corinne Heathcock in Mobile, Alabama. Natalie was the older of the two, and she came into this world on November 4th, 2005, while her younger brother Jonathan, or Chase as he was better known, was born on December 29th, 2006. Natalie was known as the Princess, and her brother Chase was called the Daredevil. Little Natalie loved Christmas, and she even adorably called the Christmas lights gumdrops. Chase was a curious boy whom his family also said was a little ladies' man. The children's parents had gotten married about 6 months after Natalie was born, but their relationship was a tumultuous one, and it resulted in many temporary separations between the two. During one separation, a friend would move in with John to help him pay for the bills. Then, when Corinne returned, she ended up sleeping with that friend. This resulted in the couple splitting up for good and filing for divorce in May of 2009. After their separation, John was awarded primary custody of both Natalie and Chase. This was because Corinne did not have the means to care for the children, as she didn't have a place to live and she didn't have a job at the time. She did still, however, have regular visits with her children and believed that they were in the best spot that they could be, being with their father. However, November 17th, 2009 would be the last time that the mother would see her two children alive. That's because in October of 2008, a woman named Heather Lavelle Keaton would come into their lives. The children's father, John, had met Heather on MySpace, and at the time, Heather, who was legally blind, was also a student at Spring Hill College. Then in 2009, she had become very sick and moved back in with her parents in Louisville, Kentucky. Once she recovered and returned to Mobile, Heather moved into John's parents, Richard and Ann Deblase's home, with John and the children. But quickly, Heather began to argue with John's mother, Ann, about the proper way to raise the children, becoming far too domineering, and therefore she was asked to move out. But John wasn't going to let Heather leave the home without him and the children, so all four of them, at that point, moved out of his parents' house. They then moved in with a friend of John's named Robin Rios and Robin's family. During their time there, Heather would complain about not wanting to raise John's children because they were not her kids. There were also some concerns about the children not being properly cared for, and this resulted in them once again being asked to find a new place to live. Soon, more concerns began to arise about the children's well-being, and friends noticed that many times Natalie and Chase appeared to be hungry and smelled bad. One couple whom the family would rent a trailer from even saw Heather holding Natalie by the hair and hitting her with a belt. They also witnessed her shove Chase to the floor. This incident was all because Heather had gotten upset that the children had eaten a slice of chocolate pie. Another friend of Heather and John's had seen Heather roughly grabbing Natalie and screaming and cursing at both children. Heather had stated that Natalie and Chase were just horrible and like demon spawn from hell. Towards the end of February 2010, John, Heather, and the children moved into the Peach Place apartments. The manager at the apartment complex would say that she saw the two children outside, unattended, near a high-traffic street. Chase also always appeared like his diaper was dirty and saggy. Soon, the children's father began attending Blue Cliff College, where he was taking massage therapy classes. While at school, John met a classmate named Renee. Renee would then give John rides back and forth from his home to school, and during these rides, John would talk about his children, his little princess, and his little flirt. Then, between January and March of 2010, John had taken a leave of absence, and when he returned back to school, Renee said that he seemed different. He was weird and often seemed very dirty. Then, he dropped out of school altogether a few months later in July. Also, in the first week of March 2010, some friends had seen the family at Walmart. And when they had seen Chase, who was out in the family's van, they were shocked by his appearance. The little boy seemed to be in a stupor, and he was very pale. When they asked where Natalie was, they were told that she was just with some friends. So in July, around the time that John dropped out of school altogether, he and Heather had also been evicted from their apartment, and for a time they lived with Heather's grandmother in Georgia, before then moving to Louisville, where Heather's mother and mother's fiancé lived. Her mother's fiancé had a retired police officer friend who lived next door to the couple, and that friend was told that the children were at that point living in Las Vegas with a relative. Some months later, on November 14th, 2010, as John was leaving his job at the airport, he would be arrested after he ran a stop sign and had no vehicle registration. He was then jailed overnight, and the following day when he went back home, Heather's mother would overhear the couple arguing. It was then that she caught on to the fact that something bad had happened to Natalie and Chase. And so she contacted the retired police officer who lived next door to the couple. When Heather was brought in for questioning, she would tell detectives that John had actually been the one who hurt his children in the past. And she had merely just been an innocent victim of his controlling behavior and abuse. She reminded authorities multiple times throughout the interview that she was blind and gullible, and only had been with John in order to help care for his children. Heather insisted that due to being partially blind, she knew that the children had passed away, but she had no idea how. She additionally told detectives that in the days prior to Natalie's death, the little girl had a toxic odor to her breath, was throwing up black stuff, and had lost control of all her bodily functions. Due to this, on March 4th, after John left for his classes at school, Natalie was put on a tarp inside the closet of their Peach Place apartment. According to Heather, she was concerned about the little girl, so she had contacted John. But the father said that he would just check up on his daughter when he got home later. When he returned back home, though, Natalie was unresponsive. So, once it was dark outside, John loaded the little girl's body into the back of his van and drove to a wooded area where he disposed of her. Then, just a few months later, on June 20th, Chase began displaying the same symptoms as Natalie, and soon he also fell unresponsive. His body was then put into the back of the van as well, and driven out to an area where he was buried. When speaking with police, Heather maintained that she'd never seen the children's bodies, and she stated that after they died, John had told her, "You can't leave me now, it's your fault." So, she had stayed. Upon examining Heather's cell phone, they retrieved voicemails that had been left for her by John. In the voicemails, he professed his love for her and cried, saying that he was sorry for the way that things had turned out. Following this interview with authorities, Heather was placed under arrest and charged with CA as well as abuse of a corpse. Then, when police spoke with the children's father, John, he confessed that both his children were indeed dead, and he was responsible for burying their bodies. However, it was Heather who had killed them. When John's van was searched, that they had previously impounded at the time of his arrest, they found pictures of Natalie and Chase, the children's stuffed animals, a duffel bag, and a container of antifreeze. When cadaver dogs were brought in, they alerted to the scent of a dead body in the back of the van. John was still denying that he had done anything to hurt the children, and now he had changed his story to say that Heather also had not hurt them. Instead, John was now telling detectives an incredible story about how his children had been kidnapped. He claimed that two masked men had taken the children in broad daylight on Father's Day. This story was quickly abandoned, however, once he realized that Heather had confessed that Natalie had died some months earlier. John then told detectives that when he had left for school on March 4th, Heather had bound Natalie's arms and legs with duct tape. She couldn't move her extremities at all, and Heather placed her inside a suitcase. But the father insisted that the suitcase was still open, and Natalie was very much alive before he left the home. According to him, this was just a form of punishment that Heather liked to inflict upon Natalie to get her to change her attitude. Family and friends called the little girl a princess, and Heather did not like that. John told officers that he'd been gone from the home for 8 to 12 hours that day, And when he had returned back home, he found his daughter unresponsive inside the suitcase. She was lifeless, cold to the touch, and stiff. Upon finding her, he dressed Natalie up in some red pajamas, then put her body in the back of his van and went to bury her. When a detective asked John why he had not called 911 instead when he found his daughter dead, he said that it was because he loved Heather and he was afraid of losing her. And he was also afraid of losing Chase and the couple's other child that Heather was currently pregnant with. Upon further questioning, John would eventually admit that on the evening of June 19th, he had witnessed Heather duct tape Chase to the handle of a broomstick as a form of punishment for having an accident. He was taped rigid to the broom handle and was unable to move his arms or legs. He was then placed in the corner of the bedroom and wedged against the wall by a dresser. A sock was then shoved into the boy's mouth and it was duct taped shut. According to John, he had to take a sleeping pill so that he could fall asleep in the same room that his son was being tortured in. The next morning, on Father's Day, John had woken up to find Chase still duct taped to the broom handle. However, the little boy was dead. Chase's body was then put into a trash bag, and he was put into the back of the van, where they transported him to the woods of Mississippi and left him. Like Heather had admitted earlier, John also said that the children had a very strong odor to their breaths, were vomiting black stuff, and had lost control of their bodily functions prior to their deaths. However, they had never sought any medical attention for them. This was likely because the last few months prior to the children's murders, they had been tortured, as they were burned by candles, cigarettes, and regularly duct taped as forms of punishment. Detectives also believe that the reason why Chase was actually killed was not because of a bathroom incident like John said, but rather because a few months after his sister passed away, he was crying and asking for her out in public, which would have been a liability for the couple. It wasn't until nearly a month after Natalie and Chase were discovered to be missing that authorities would finally find their bodies. On December 8, 2010, a search party discovered human remains in the woods off of Highway 57 in Van Cleve, Mississippi. There was duct tape with the remains that had blonde hairs attached to it, and when the pieces were retaped together, they formed the dimensions of a child's head, and would have covered a child's entire face with only the nose exposed. These remains would later be identified as belonging to Chase. Then, just a few days later, on December 11th, Natalie's remains were found off of Beverly Jeffries Highway in Citronelle, Alabama. When an autopsy was conducted, neither child's cause of death could be identified, although the pathologist confirmed that their deaths were likely due to homicidal violence. The children's father, John Deblase, was placed under arrest as well, and he was charged with use of a corpse, aggravated assault, and 2 counts of felony murder. Heather also had her charges upgraded at this time to capital murder. Both adults pleaded not guilty. Now, Heather's mother, Helena Keaton, said that since her daughter is legally blind, she was completely dependent on John, and she suspected that John poisoned both her and the children. According to her, John had forced her daughter to go on a drive somewhere, before he then stopped the vehicle and grabbed something out of the back. She said her daughter, who was pregnant with John's child at the time, was unsure of what this was. However, she now believes that it was one of the children's bodies. John's parents, on the other hand, believed that it was Heather who was very controlling in the relationship, and she had forced him to move out of the home where he lived with them and the children. They also believed that she was the one to kill Natalie and Chase while John was attending night classes. Then, she had manipulated him to get rid of their bodies. They, however, said this does not mean that they are excusing their son. They said, as a parent, we have a responsibility to protect our kids. He failed to protect his kids. While he was in jail, John would write several letters in which he talks about Heather giving him an ultimatum that he could be with her or he could be with his children. And blinded by love, he chose her. He allowed his girlfriend to treat Natalie and Chase as she wished. John stated that there were times when Heather had forced Natalie and Chase to stand in the corner for long periods of time, beaten them with belts, and even put poison in their sippy cups. Yet the father did nothing to help his innocent children. In one letter, John spoke about how he had found Natalie gagged and dead inside the suitcase. But in other letters, he said that she was still alive inside the suitcase when he found her. According to these letters, when he had found his daughter alive, he had taken her out of the suitcase and asked her why she wasn't listening to Heather. Then, he choked Natalie until she died. But he said that this was just to stop the torture that his girlfriend was inflicting on Natalie. As Heather was sitting in jail awaiting her trial, she began speaking to her cellmate and told her that she and John had stopped to buy a video game on their way to dispose of Chase's body. She stated that they were so happy that they now had more time to play this video game since the children were both dead. Heather also spoke about her intense hatred for Natalie and told her cellmate that she had given the children spaghetti laced with antifreeze. In November of 2014, John Deblase went to trial and he was found guilty on 3 counts of capital murder. A few months later, he would be sentenced to death via lethal injection. In May of 2015, Heather Lavelle Keaton would go to trial as well, and it was the prosecutor's viewpoint that she had killed Natalie and Chase because she was jealous of them and wanted them gone. The Mobile District Attorney said, "We believe that Heather Keaton is a domineering, manipulative, deceitful, and morally unhinged woman. Ultimately, Heather would be found guilty of capital murder in regards to Chase's death. However, she was only found guilty of reckless manslaughter in relation to Natalie's death. She would also receive the sentence of death by lethal injection." Though both John and Heather have appealed their sentences multiple times, they have been rejected, and both of them are still sitting on death row in Alabama. Memorial services were held for Natalie and her little brother Chase on Saturday, January 8, 2011, at Mobile Memorial Gardens Funeral Home in Mobile, Alabama. Well, thank you for listening to Natalie and Chase's story today. It is insane that you can hate 2 children so much that you'll do anything to get them out of your way. It's also completely insane that their father, John, just went along with Heather hurting and killing his children. His children, whom up until meeting that evil woman, he seemed to adore. I'm glad that these 2 monsters got the death penalty for what they did to Natalie and Chase. It's what they deserve, because those poor babies went through absolute hell in the last few months of their lives. So, if you like true crime and you want to hear it from me, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button below, and turn on those notifications too, so you'll know when I upload a new video, which is at least 3 times every single week. Thanks for watching A Wicked World today. Until next time, take care guys. Bye. Thank you to all the patrons of A Wicked World. Now, there's even more of A Wicked World on Patreon, so check it out on patreon.com/awickedworld, or use the Patreon app. You'll have access to exclusive videos each month and more. Any support truly helps to make sure the victims are never forgotten, and to highlight the shortcomings of society associated with each case. Do you have a suggestion for a story you'd like to see me cover? If so, send me an email to awickedworldtruecrime@gmail.com.